can you keep a secret?
Changing hearts and minds.
Changing hearts and minds.
Welcome to Change Your POV podcast. You're listening to Changing Hearts and Minds, a show about reviving the warrior spirit and remembering the past to improve our future. I'm your host, Jeff Adamec. Let's get this party started.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I totally screwed or what? You're funny.
I want to discuss all this behavior.
Let me out of here!
Hey there, listeners. Welcome to part 2 of Daniel Boone. If you haven't heard part 1, I recommend to go back to last week's episode and listen to the first half of the 2-part episode on Daniel Boone. And if you have listened to it, I welcome you back and remind you that we are just getting started with the Daniel Boone story. So instead of keeping you guys in waiting for a long, drawn-out intro, let's jump right back in with me and my guest, Andrew McDowell from Neophyte in the Woods, as we continue the story of the American legacy and hero, Daniel Boone.
So he's served in this in conflict and has been promoted. Eventually, the war comes to an end after Virginia's militia defeats an army of natives in the Battle of Point Pleasant. This occurs in October 1774, and the Shawnees end up abandoning their claims to Kentucky. Whether or not they actually knew what that meant in kind of the context of European land ownership, I think is an open point, but they signed a document saying that they don't have any claim to Kentucky and that they'll stop attacking trappers,
Right,
and hunters and settlers. After the war ends, a judge in North Carolina named Richard Henderson, who would play a pretty big role in Boone's life, actually hired Boone to travel throughout North Carolina and Tennessee to visit Cherokee towns and negotiate a meeting with the tribes. And this was not just a PR stunt or a public relations campaign. It was actually to orchestrate a gathering of the tribes so that Henderson and other investors in North Carolina could purchase land in Kentucky and establish a colony that they were going to call Transylvania. Not vampire Transylvania, but Transylvania.
Don't you dare do that, because I have my dreams and hopes that he was actually a vampire. And then you thwart that by saying stuff like that. It's gonna jack with my head.
You can edit that out if you want.
I might not. I might leave it in there just to show everyone how obviously uneducated you are. I mean, he was obviously a vampire.
Clearly, okay. I think we're gonna have to go back and I think there's some fan fiction here, some Daniel fan fiction with sparkling vampires. I'm going to let you write that.
You son of a bitch. By saying sparkling vampires, you ruined it again. Now I can't go with the vampires if he's going to be a sparkling vampire.
Sorry, man. I just keep screwing this up. So the other thing they wanted to do was make it easier for settlers to get to Transylvania with all the vampires. And they wanted to cut something and blaze something called the Wilderness Road. At the time, there were public infrastructure projects. The Mass Turnpike parallels and falls along the old Boston Post Road. So there were infrastructure projects. They were actually by and large privately financed, which is why this guy Henderson ended up financing this, because he could then charge tolls or could own the right of way and make people pay him for the right to move west. This negotiation and purchase, like almost everything at this time, was not without controversy. The Cherokee themselves probably didn't actually have the rights to sell the land that they negotiated with the settlers. It was probably kind of owned in common amongst the native tribes, or not owned at all. It was just understood that it was for everybody. A Cherokee chief at the time has been rumored to have told Boone, "We have given you good land, but I fear you'll not be able to successfully settle upon it." This was, I think, pretty clearly foreshadowing of some of the struggles to come.
Yeah, I think they would have been better. They would have been better served actually trying to negotiate with the Shawnee. As you look into what's going to come up later with what happens between these settlers and the native tribes, but the Shawnee seem to be the ones who actually owned the land, not the Cherokees.
And the Cherokees just seemed to be convenient, and somebody with whom they already had a relationship. So it's kind of like, well, let's just go with what we know and hope it works out. So it ended up being Boone and this group spearhead the effort and established a town that's still there today, called Boonesboro. It's a settlement and a fort in Kentucky. Boone and a larger group of settlers brought their whole families to Boonesboro in and around September of 1775, which brings us to kind of the next big period in Boone's life.
Yeah, the American Revolution. So, American Revolution begins in 1775. Almost immediately, violence erupts in Kentucky, and the reason why is because the Native Americans, unhappy with the purchase and treaties that they've been handed, saw the revolution as a chance to drive out colonials and settlers, all along the frontier. Increasingly frequent attacks on the settlers left the area surrounding Boonesboro with less than 200 settlers left by late spring of 1776. So they had close to 1,000 people who had settled the area, and by 1776, boom, down to 200. And it's all a result of these increased attacks by the Native American tribes, generally the Shawnee, along the Boonesboro area. July 5th, 1776, and here we go. This is going to be, guys, this is going to be the story that makes Daniel Boone, all right? July 5th, 1776, Boone's daughter Jemima, along with two other teenage girls, decided they didn't want to be strap hung inside the fort, and they actually snuck out, and they were hanging out in the area, and they, oh look, there's a river, and there was a canoe there on the river, and they jump in the canoe and they cross the river. The second they get to the other side, a war party of Shawnee jump up and take them. So they've been taken north. They're taking these kids north towards the Ohio River, where the location of the tribe's encampment was. Boone and a group of other men who found out about the taking of these girls followed vigorously in pursuit. All right, Boone's fame becomes solidified during this when he decides to abandon the actual known trails and track the war party using only his knowledge of the native tribes and the land that was around the area. It's a massive gamble because he's walking blindly with no trail out into the middle of the wilderness to try to track these guys, on top of the fact that he's got this party of men following him who questioned whether or not he was making the right decision. Now, it was Boone's daughter who was taken, so they kind of let him make this decision. I think had it been some other guys' daughters, I'm sure the guys, other two girls' fathers were there, but they probably didn't have the leadership presence that Boone had. But had it been somebody else's kids that Boone was out there looking for, I don't think he would have been allowed to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he takes it, it's his kid. So they're like, go ahead, buddy. It's a massive gamble, and it pays off remarkably because Boone and his party were able to catch up after being behind almost a day behind these Indians. They catch up, and while they're having dinner, stopping to eat, they ambush and save the lives of Boone's daughter and the other two girls. And they're able to, there's stories of Boone's daughter sitting there, and she said she looks out into the wood line. She can see her father and the guys coming up, and it's like really great story, awesome stuff. It was such a great story and became so celebrated that it is solidified the legend of Daniel Boone by being the inspiration for the classic novel by James Fenimore Cooper, The Last of the Mohicans. So you read Last of the Mohicans, you watch the movie with Daniel Day-Lewis. That movie is the story with different names of this incident. I mean, that's how widespread this incident became well known as, and pretty much made Daniel Boone a household name in the colonies and in America at the time. Definitely inspired James Fenimore Cooper because he wrote a great book, and if you haven't read it, you need to. And if you don't like reading, at least watch the movie because the movie is fantastic. You know what I mean?
It's a quality film.
It really is, and it's to me, it's the movie that makes My Left Foot great, wonderful, but Last of the Mohicans is what made Daniel Day-Lewis a great actor, in my opinion. It's what got people to know who he was, at least, because it is a really good movie, and I'll brag on it just because we go back to the relation thing, but I mean that's a cool story to have associated with your family, is that he goes out there and saves these guys, or saves these girls. So Last of the Mohicans, based on this now, this is what makes him famous, right? So moving on now, 1777, Henry Hamilton, the British lieutenant governor, began recruiting Native American war parties to raid the Kentucky settlements. This is during the Revolutionary War now, so the British lieutenant governor is trying to, unconventional warfare, guerrilla warfare tactic his way out of the war by attacking settlers and drawing the focus of the war off of the colonial army and pushing it towards trying to protect the settlers. So he goes out and he gets all these Indian chiefs to go out and attack these settlements. And one of the Indian chiefs he recruits is a Shawnee chief by the name of Chief Blackfish. This guy becomes pivotal and almost you can't have a talk about him in history without Daniel Boone associated with it, and vice versa. So I mean, him and Daniel Boone are kind of like synonymous. If during the Daniel Boone TV show that happened back in the 50s, Chief Blackfish was like a pivotal part of the show. He was one of the main characters, even though that show is completely wrong. Everything in it's just off. He is somebody that is just associated with him. So the Shawnee Indian chief, Chief Blackfish, starts an attack and a siege on Boonesboro, the fort at Boonesboro. This is by the lieutenant governor, the lieutenant governor of Canada or somewhere up there. I'll look into it and sneak it in there later on. But anyway, this lieutenant governor's got these Indians attacking Boonesboro, and this siege begins on Boonesboro. Daniel Boone, during one of the attacks, was shot through the ankle. And while laying there, shot in the ankle under a massively heavy amount of gunfire, being a combat veteran and being in ambushes, I foresee a heavy amount of gunfire in the Revolutionary War time period as being like 4 or 5 rounds hitting within 100 meters of him laying there. That might be a little arrogant, but that's what I'm envisioning in my head. Now, probably not. I'm going to say, let's say that it was a really heavy amount of gunfire and they were pinpointing this guy in. It was apparently enough gunfire for it to be an issue. But this man, Simon Kenton, who was a recent arrival at Boonesboro, ran out under fire, picked up and carried Boone back to the fort. So Simon Kenton became Boone's best friend, and after this incident, and for the rest of his life. And this man has also become a legend on the frontier. And I know a lot of people that are listening right now don't know who he is. I recommend you go and look into Simon Kenton and find this guy was an excellent marksman. Was a great frontiersman. Like I said, became best friends with Daniel Boone, and so this created a lifelong friendship between these two men. When Simon Kenton ran out, picked up a wounded Daniel Boone and carried him back into the fort. After the long siege of Boonesboro, the fort found itself short on salt, and that may sound ridiculous, but you have to understand what salt was to people on the frontier. Salt is necessary to preserve food. All right. You have to have it to preserve food in the frontier. Without it, the fort stood no chance of surviving the winter. So all their meat had to be treated with salt to be able to be cured and last throughout the wintertime. These attacks left the fort completely devoid of any salt. They were completely without. They needed to have this salt. So Daniel Boone had to put together a team of people to go out and get some salt. And the best place for them to go is this place called the Licking River. All right, the Licking River, and it's not like Salt Lick. I think Salt Lick, Licking River. I don't know if that's associated, but
that's exactly correct.
It's really, is it? Yep. That's cool that I put that together on my own. I mean, I guess I can be taught. So the Licking River incident. This was another major part of Boone's history, and I'm going to let Andrew tell you guys about the Licking River incident.
Sure. So, as Jeff just said, at this point in the war, Boonesboro was out of salt and running low on food. So Boone led a party of about 30 men in January of 1778 to the salt springs on the Licking River to try to gather both meat and salt for the settlement. It takes them just over a month to get there. In early February of 1778, Boone and his party were hunting for meat for themselves and to bring back. And the expedition ended up being surprised and captured. That Chief Blackfish that Jeff referred to before was the war party, was leading the war party that captured them. The party greatly outnumbered Boone and his men. You hear everything from 2-1 to 3-1 to 4-1. This was a disparity of forces that even Daniel Boone's kind of leadership probably wasn't going to help them out with. So there was an offer from Chief Blackfish to meet with Boone and to take a surrender. But Boone, meets with him and says, I'll go, we'll take it back to the men and see what they want to do. And Boone actually goes back and convinces his men, rather than fight to the last, to surrender. Blackfish at the time had intentions to continue to Boonesboro. And with, because Boone and the leadership of the town was not there, and was under Blackfish's control, it was more likely, he felt, that they were going to be able to capture Boonesboro. However, Daniel Boone, being the charismatic individual that he is, convinced Blackfish that the undefended women and children at Boonesboro weren't worth the dangerous winter trek, and the plan to attack ended up being scuttled. Boone actually also convinced them that the following spring he'd lead them back to take the fort with no fight and no loss of honor, because there was no need to kill women and children to take the fort. There's some, was this a ploy by Boone, or was it true? Was Boone actually offering to do this? It's just a question about that, because Boone was stalling for time on one hand, but also, might have really meant this. His wife and kids and family were still there.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think when you look at it, I think we have this for the time period, being a traitor, being a coward, it had everything to do with whether or not you were willing to just die. So, military as he was, and he was a man who held military rank, ultimately he was a frontiersman, and they were survivalists, and it's all about surviving. And so you utilize, he's not a university trained or a military institute trained military man. This is a man who grew up on the frontier, and he had learned everything he knew was all about surviving. And given the situation, his men were going to be wiped out if they'd put up a fight. It serves no purpose just to allow yourself to get wiped out. His wife and his children, and along with the wives and kids of all the other men that were with him, are back at Fort Boonesboro, and they're not defended. They're going to be wiped out by this tribe. And the Shawnee had not shown Boone that they were civilized, in his opinion. He had seen, the brutal murder of his son years before was at the hands of these tribesmen, and so he didn't have very high hopes that it was going to be not a slaughter. So do you fault him for? And this is at the time, looking at his decision right then and there. Do you fault him for taking a different way out than just allowing himself to be slaughtered for the sake of honor? Or do you try to look at it as the picture as a whole, which we're going to see as we talk about this more, and see that he made a better decision later on by doing it the way that he was doing it? And I think that's where the issue with people and Boone and this incident come into play.
Yep, absolutely. So during this same time, this attempt to stall the attack on Boonesboro, it was so convincing, and Boone did such a good job, arguing the point, that many of Boone's own men actually believed that Boone had flipped, and had switched sides over to the British and supporting the Indians, and started to label him as a traitor. Obviously, this isn't true, but it was, kind of perception on the ground, and speaks to Boone's passion and ability to persuade. After, being captured and convincing the war band not to attack Boonesboro, Boone and his men were taken to Chillicothe, which was kind of the war party's base of operations. In Shawnee culture, it's customary for warriors captured to be adopted by the tribe to replace lost warriors from the conflict, and this actually was done by Boone and some of his men. Then they were taken to Detroit, where the British military was and were taken prisoner. Boone himself, it's interesting to note, was actually adopted by Chief Blackfish, and was given an Indian name, for lack of a better term, of Sheltowee, I believe, which means big turtle. During this period of captivity, Boone kind of bided his time, and wasn't making constant attempts to escape. Uh, he eventually discovered that there was a large-scale attack being prepared by the Shawnee. At this point, he did his best to escape and and take advantage of kind of the trust that they had placed in him by adopting him, and towards North Carolina and towards Boonesboro.
Right. This is almost a year. I mean, you talk about this is almost a year
Yep.
after his capture, and like we said before, the perception of Boone's men. He was, first of all, he was someone that had a relationship with the Indians for years. The Native Americans, Indians, no offense intended, but he had a relationship with them for years, going all the way back to his childhood. He respected their culture. He understood their culture. He knew that it served him no purpose to try to escape right away. As far as him gathering intelligence and winning hearts and minds, or winning over the hearts and minds of the tribes, it was a well placed move on his part to just accept his situation as it is and wait it out to see what happened. As men that were there and also taken, who did these numerous attempts to escape, did not see it that way and came up with a very bad taste in their mouth about what Boone was doing. I'd hate to say it, but you have uneducated frontiersmen who don't understand, political or strategic views on things. Therefore, I don't fault them for not understanding, but I do give them a little bit of a leeway with that, but also keep that in mind, that the reason why they felt he was a traitor was because they didn't understand the big picture of what was going on. And yes, it wasn't when he found out of this imminent large-scale attack on Boonesboro, he made his escape. And like you said, it was a big, bold move for 5 days on horseback until his horse died.
5 days on horseback. Yep.
And then I think how many miles was it back to Boonesboro?
160 plus back to Boonesboro.
Right. He crossed that in 5 or 6 days, I think.
Yep, 5 days on horseback. And he makes it back and warns of the attack. Boone was gone for a long time, and I think that it's likely that most people assumed that he was dead. So while he was in captivity, Boone's wife and kids had left Boonesboro, returned to the Yadkin in North Carolina, with that assumption that their father was dead. And this is kind of a painful period for Boone. Obviously his family thought they were dead, but also upon his return, his loyalty was questioned because he had apparently, as Jeff was just talking about, lived so happily and peacefully among the Shawnee. So Boone was kind of faced with a dilemma here. He could kind of take it and move on with his life, or he could try to prove his loyalty to the cause in some meaningful way. And he, being a man of action, he took that second course. So to prove that he didn't have any loyalty to the Shawnee, he led a preemptive strike on the gathering Shawnee war bands on the other side of the Ohio River. After that attack, they fell back to Boonesboro and defended it successfully from the attack. It ended up being a 10-day long siege by Chief Blackfish. It was successfully ended on September 7th of 1778 when Blackfish fell back and gave up on his attacks.
Yeah, after the siege, so the siege ends, 10 days, Blackfish goes away. Boone is, in action alone, vindicated, because he does attack the Shawnee. Shows, obviously his intent was to protect the fort. This all falls on deaf ears with some of the men. All right. After the siege, there's a man, Captain Benjamin Logan and Captain Richard Galloway, both of whom who had relatives still in captivity from the Boone's Salt Party that had been captured, brought charges against Boone and made accusations of traitorous activity. Boom, court-martial follows. Why does court-martial follow? Because Boone insists that he gets a court-martial and gets put on trial for it, and wants to be found in the eyes of his unit and his peers. He wants to be found innocent. So court-martial follows. Boone ultimately was found not guilty, and because of the actions he took during the actual siege and the lives he ultimately saved, he was actually promoted to major. Regardless of the promotion and the vindication from the not guilty findings of the court-martial, Boone was humiliated for the accusations of being a traitor, and the continued doubt of his allegiances that were still evident in the men of Boonesboro. He decided to leave Boonesboro, never to return. Rarely spoke of the events at all for the remainder of his life. I mean, this was something that affected him that harshly. So Boone leaves Boonesboro, goes back to North Carolina. Obviously, a happy reunion with the family who thought he was dead. He collects them all up and returns right back to Kentucky in 1779. Again, with a large group of others to set up a settlement. Now, this is something that you can find in some places. It's not necessarily canon, if you will, to the American lexicon. But according to some, this group that he returned back to Kentucky with also included the family of Abraham Lincoln, which I think is just a really cool little side note. So Abraham Lincoln's family, along with a bunch of other people, accompanied Boone in 1779 back to Kentucky, where they found the settlement of Boone Station. Boone, at this time, there's a little bit of a lull. He's kind of separated from the fighting at the time. He earned money at this time by locating land for settlers, so he did a lot of land speculation. He continued to serve in the American Revolution, fighting into the Battle of Pequot. During one hunting trip with his brother Ned, Shawnees attacked Daniel and his brother and actually shot and killed his brother Ned. Boone escaped that incident, but the Shawnees themselves, thinking they had killed Boone, beheaded his brother Ned and took his head back as a trophy. And so, again, the Shawnees obviously were not happy with Boone for what he had done with the Blackfish incident. They never really seemed to like Boone, and cutting off his brother's head and taking it back as a trophy, thinking it was Daniel Boone, I think it goes to show that in and of itself shows where Boone's allegiances really lied. And so I think that kind of puts it to bed. In 1781, Boone was elected to the Virginia legislature. And on his way to his inauguration, he was captured by British dragoons near the town of Charlottesville, which, that's really odd. Charlottesville, who, honest to God, man, I had never heard of Charlottesville till a couple weeks ago.
I know.
And now I can't escape the damn town.
It's everywhere.
I mean, it's the hometown of like 3 presidents. It's just weird. It's just something it never really came up on my radar, and now it's all over the place. So on his way to Charlottesville to accept his Virginia legislature appointment, he's captured by the British dragoons, and he was actually tortured along with the other legislators. And what's really weird, and this is something that I found really odd, so they torture him for a couple days, and then they just release him under what they call it's not a pardon, but it's kind of like he was released on parole, kind of.
Yep.
So it was considered a parole releasal. Kind of like at the time, guys were released on parole after they were caught because they would claim, as long as they promised not to take up arms against the British again, they were kind of released on parole. And I think that was kind of the auspices of what these guys were released under. So, but they were tortured.
Yeah, gentlemen were paroled because they gave their word that they wouldn't do it.
Right. So, I assume that Boone must have done that. But during Boone's term in the legislature, Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in 1781. So fighting in Kentucky continued despite the surrender. In August of 1782, Boone took part in the Battle of Blue Licks, and his son Israel was killed during this battle. So, I mean, Boone's really giving a lot of his family to the cause and to the kind of life he lived. I mean, I can't even imagine losing one son. I mean, this is what, the third or fourth, not to mention his brothers who lost their lives. Thank God that his brother Jonathan didn't lose his life, because I may not have my wife Sarah right now if not for it. So anyway, Boone also took part in the Clark expedition into the Ohio. This was the last major campaign of the American Revolution. And so that closes out the American Revolution for Daniel Boone, but it does not close out our story.
Nope.
Let's talk a little bit. Let's quickly go over the post-revolution activities of Mr. Daniel Boone. Andrew?
Sure. So after the war, Boone ended up moving yet again to a town that was at the time called Limestone. It's now called Marysville. It's in Kentucky. This was in 1786. He had been also elected, during the war to the Virginia State Assembly for Bourbon County, and kind of wound down his responsibilities there. He ended up keeping a tavern and working as a surveyor, horse trader, land speculator. During this period. Initially, he was successful. Um,
Okay,
you know,
let me
in the,
do
yep,
this.
that's
Let me
what
do this part just so because it is my family. So,
yeah.
full disclosure, guys, Daniel Boone owned slaves. I have a those of you who've spoken with me offline, and I have some friends who really support Confederates, the Confederate side of the all that stuff, right? They know my feelings about slavery. I find it to be one of the darkest and most horrific parts of the American history. I do not give any excuses to anyone who owns slaves. They own what they did, and I believe wholeheartedly that what they did was wrong. However, I do have to admit that at the time of this stuff going on in the United States, it was not it was something that was so common that I don't think they realized the horror of what they were doing. And
Yep.
that's about as much of an excuse I'll give them. So, owning slaves is Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, George Washington owned slaves. This is dark stuff that our founding fathers were participating in. We finally did get our shit together and move away from it. And it seems like we've been struggling for years to deal with the fact that we had this dark part of our history. So full disclosure, yes, Daniel Boone owned slaves, and apparently he owned quite a bit for the Kentucky area.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't use that against him to negate all the other things that he did. I hope to God that he realized, because he didn't own slaves for very long. And I can only hope that he didn't own slaves for very long because he saw the error of his ways. But it's probably unlikely. He probably just stopped owning slaves because he couldn't afford it. But
Yeah.
he did own slaves, and so that's just something that I did want to make out there. Full disclosure. So
Yep.
he was by no means completely infallible.
Agreed. So it's during this period that Boone's fame also starts to be on the rise. In 1784, on his 50th birthday, a guy named John Filson, who was a historian of the region, published a book, or a pamphlet, really more like, called "The Discovery, Settlement, and the Present State of Kentucky," which was a book about Daniel Boone's adventures. And it's at this point that he really starts to become an American folk hero. Even though he's got that going on. At the same time, the American Revolution had more or less ended the border war with Native Americans, but it still kind of smoldered in the northern part of the Ohio River where Boone's living now. It's known in the history books as the Northwest Indian War, and this is a war. I mean, there are battles going on. It's not just raid and counter raid. There's a battle called Fallen Timbers, which eventually kind of ends the war in 1786. An expedition in which Boone participated was kind of the incident that's put an end to the war, and would also be the last time that Boone actually took place in military action. Remember, by this time he's around 50 years old, 50 plus, so he's 50 years old in the 1780s is
ancient.
like,
ancient is the word you're looking for, man.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
ancient.
It's like being 70 or 80 and still participating in active combat. So
I'll let you know how that works out when I'm doing it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let me know. So it's also at this point that Boone's financial troubles start to spiral out of hand. His trailblazing and frontier persona didn't fit very well in civilization, so folks were a little less willing to extend him credit based on past failures. He got sued, having to do with his surveying and land speculation. He actually was in so much debt that he couldn't purchase anything on credit, and he ended up being so frustrated with the legal hassles surrounding his surveying and land speculation business, he moved to West Virginia, what's now Point Pleasant. In Point Pleasant, Boone operated a trading post and was appointed lieutenant colonel of the county militia, which, partially symbolic, partially, real work. Everybody in the South, the famous people are Colonel Sanders, right? To my knowledge, Colonel Sanders never served in the military, but it was kind of bestowed upon him as an honorary title.
Made some great chicken, though.
It's delicious. It is. If you extend the word chicken to what they serve at KFC. During this period, he's again elected to the Virginia legislature. But at this, for every step forward, he has a step back. Because he couldn't purchase goods on credit for his store, he had to close it and return to hunting and trapping again as an older gentleman. In 1795, Boone moves back to Kentucky and ends up living on land owned by their son Daniel Morgan Boone. But he's still looking for something to do, and he's kind of one of those guys that always needs to be moving. So he starts up a business trailblazing and surveying again, but he wasn't able to find any business because I think the book was out on him, and folks realized that he was good at his job, but he wasn't good business wise, so they weren't really willing to work with him, like they maybe had been 10 or 20 years before.
Yeah, his debts had really caught up to him, and they kind of, like I said before, the indebtedness, the being considered a person in debt was a killer to people back then, and he just could not get anyone to work with him because they were going to lose money, and people were going to come after him. He owed more debt than he was ever going to be able to pay off. He couldn't own land. It really was a tragic ending to his American legend, really.
Yep. And this is an interesting period because there's a warrant issued for his arrest for debt. They had debtors' prisons at the time. But that same year, actually the very same period, the Kentucky Assembly named Boone County in his honor. So, for every step forward, like I said, he had a step or two back, and it's just kind of an interesting up or down. Continuing on another theme with Boone, he ends up moving again. This time he moved further west to Missouri because of his financial and legal issues. He always just trying to stay a step or two ahead of the law when it came to getting thrown into debtor's prison. His plan was to make a fresh start, and he was one of America's pioneers and heroes, but he didn't own any land of his own. Missouri at the time was controlled by the nation of Spain, which was a great power at the time, and he was given land and was appointed syndic, which is kind of a judge and jury position by the governor of Missouri and the commandant of the area. He was known to be very fair in his judgments during his tenure, and in his roles, he was pretty well respected. So we're in the very early 1800s, and then in 1804, a little land deal was done, known as the Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah, little land deal.
Little land deal. It only tripled the size of the United States at the time. No big deal. I mean, whatever. It's like buying half an acre somewhere. So following the Louisiana Purchase, Missouri came back into the United States, which was both a good and a bad thing. The land he had settled was now part of the United States, and he was thus the courts were able to catch up with him there, and all of his Spanish lands were seized, and all of his titles were stripped as well. However, Congress, recognizing kind of his great service and role in blazing the frontier, was asked to restore his Spanish land claims, and they agreed. They restored his claims, but he then sold them off to pay his debts from his time in Kentucky.
Which I think goes to the honor that he had as a human being. So he wins all of his Spanish land claims, but he immediately sells all of his land to pay off all of his debts, and it works out because he's clean with the house, so to speak, at the end. So on September 26, 1820, at his son Nathan Boone's home in Femme Osage Creek, just 2.5 months short of his 86th birthday, Daniel Boone died of natural causes. His last words were said to be, "I'm going now, my time has come," which just, when you die and you know it, and that gets to be your last words, that's kind of cool. He's buried next to his wife, Rebecca, who had passed, unfortunately, on March 18th of 1813, and both graves were unmarked until the mid-1830s. The remains of both were disinterred and reburied in Frankfort Cemetery in Frankfort, Kentucky, The people of Missouri were not happy with this. The legend starting from that resentment of the remains being moved in Missouri, sparked a rumor that the remains had not been actually moved, and that the fact that they weren't marked at first led them to be improperly marked, so that Daniel Boone's remains and his wife's remains weren't moved. It was the remains of somebody else. Ultimately, who knows? Who knows in the end who's actually buried where? It doesn't really matter, because the legend of Daniel Boone was solidified in American history from that point forward. And like I said, he was clean with the house. Before we close out, because this was your idea,
Yep.
Andrew, to do, I want you to just tell us what made you think about bringing Daniel Boone on the show as the person you wanted to talk about, and what does he mean to you as an American history or as a folk legend?
Sure. I think it's kind of a two-sided coin for me. I really respect people who blaze new trails and explore new areas and do new things. And Boone definitely did that. I also think he's a pretty complex character. He was obviously an explorer and wasn't opposed to violence, but he went out of his way to be fair and equal and where he could be kind and respectful, but at the same time wasn't willing to just kind of always turn the other cheek when push came to shove. One of the kind of the interesting things there is he's engaged in all this fighting against the British and the Indians. And from a young age, he obviously was raised to respect and interact with Indians kind of in positive grounds. He would tell his children at a couple of times in his life that in all the fighting, he only killed maybe 5 Indians, in his entire life. The rest of it was, that he was sure about. At this time, Indians weren't people. I mean, let's lay that out there. If you killed an Indian, you weren't going to get into trouble. It was just part of kind of the cost of doing business.
Right.
And the fact that he went out of his way to seek equitable or peaceful situations where they were practicable, I think is really laudable. And, that's something that draws him to me. And, I think the other side is, being perfectly frank, he was one of the great American hunters. And that's obviously something that I'm passionate about. And I respect the hell out of. I actually started reading up about Daniel Boone because I wanted to know more about hunting, and I wanted to, see if there was anything I could learn from, the writings about him and his approach that would help me while I'm chasing deer up here in New England this fall. And unfortunately, the tactics they used back then really don't do very much for me. But it was, it certainly opened my eyes to kind of a whole new world of American history.
Right on, man. Well, I appreciate you bringing them up too, because like
Absolutely.
I said, it was able for me to get to be able to crowbar in my own family's legacy and connection with Daniel Boone, and the fact that we did joke around about it when we first talked about it, that how lucky is it for the descendants of Daniel Boone to know that they're related to Jeff Adamec?
Absolutely.
I mean, it goes both ways. No, I'm just
Great
kidding.
Americans
I'm just kidding. Daniel Boone is definitely so much more important to the American history than I am, and although people would say that they would argue that one way or the other, that's just the way I believe. Well, guys, that's it. That is the story of Daniel Boone. I want to take a moment to thank Andrew again for coming on, as he always does, and doing such a great job of being thorough, a source of information, and really a great companion for me during these shows about history. I really enjoy every single moment we're doing these with Andrew, and really appreciate him bringing it up and getting me a chance to talk about somebody in my family or my extended family, that was so important to American history. For everyone else out there, I just want to remind you guys that you are in complete control of your life. Nobody can tell you what you can and can't do. You get out there, you do what you want to do, and you do what you need to do. Be great, be bold, don't be afraid, don't let fear lead you. Free the oppression of your mind, get out there and do great things. Dio Presso Liber. We'll see you guys next week.
Change your POV and all of its shows can help and heal and even educate. We want you to help us help others. Visit our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/changeyourpov. Become a patron of our network and our mission.